not 11:15 yet, so. If I speak with my mask on, can you hear me okay? All right. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels but have not love. No. I don't see anybody heading this way, so I guess we can start. I am Matthew Stengel. I'm the pastor of Kenmore United Methodist Church. Some of you may have met me before. I was told to introduce myself, so we are online as well. We're being live streamed as well as gathering here in the sanctuary. I do not have any more of the packets. Does anybody want one of the packets but did not get one? Okay, good. Well, that's good because there aren't any more. So, but I could have made some more. Last week we went over kind of the basic structure of the United Methodist Church and how decisions are made. I do want to reiterate that only General Conference can make policy for the United Methodist Church. General Conference meets every 4 years, usually in the same years of the presidential elections in the United States. It happens to be that. It doesn't. I don't know that they chose those years as because of that, but it does generally happen. It would have. We had a general conference in 2016. We would have had one in 2020, except for the COVID crisis and large gatherings of people were shut down at that time. They postponed it for a year, and a year later we were still not able to have gatherings of people in one physical place. And also we have people coming from all over the world, from many places in the world, from Europe, from Africa, from the Philippines, to the United States for the General Conference. There's always difficulty in people obtaining visas to come to the United States from some of the countries where United Methodism is established, and during COVID, it's even more so. Therefore, we have not yet had a decision on what will become of the church going forward, because only General Conference can make those decisions, and General Conference has not been able to meet since 2019, which was a special General Conference dealing with issues of human sexuality, and that proved to be a very divisive conference. And out of that division, a number of groups came to the table. Various factions of the church, if you will, came together to create a protocol for separation with grace, was what they first called it. And I guess before I go into a lot of explanation, I would ask if there are any questions that you have around these issues. Are there things that you want to make sure that I address before we get into the issues around, particularly around human sexuality? You've all read and digested this material in detail, correct? Okay. All right. Did you bring your folders with you? So if I send you to a particular place, you can do it. Okay. I would encourage you to pull out then the social principles, which is a big fat thing. It says Social Principles 2016 at the top of it. Somebody has been handling my glasses. And my suit coat is not the best way to clean it. But anyway. And I would invite you to turn to paragraph 161, the nurturing community, on page 4. And down at the bottom, the last paragraph or the last section on that page is the area of human sexuality. I just hold your finger in that spot for a minute. Do you remember when the United Methodist Church was created as the United Methodist Church? When was that? 1968, that's correct. At the next General Conference, which would have been when? 4 years later, 1972, correct. In 1972, a document called the Social Principles was created. And the Social Principles address a number of areas. It's divided up into the natural, our position on the natural world, on the nurturing community, as they call it, the social community, the economic community, the political community, the world community, and then there's a social creed, which is paragraph 166 at the end. The social principles were created not to have the force of law in the United Methodist Church. Oh, thank you so much. Wow. An actual glasses cleaning thing. My problem is I take them on, I put them on, I take them off, I put them on, take them off, and my fingers get all over them. Thank you so much. Do you trust me to give this back to you later? I lost Marty's name tag, so. Or so far it's lost, anyway. So she's actually trusting me with her glasses cleaning rag. 1972, is that where I was? Yeah, in 1972, the social principles were created. It does not have the force of law. The discipline has the force of law generally in the United Methodist Church. But the social principles are a guide to our social behavior, our behavior among the people of the world. And they speak about labor relations, about the environment, about how we should, treat all kinds of people in various kinds of situations. In 1972, as they were closing the discussion around the social principles, an amendment was made to the section on human sexuality. And where? Okay, at the bottom of page 6 in the document that I gave you, this is the wording, or the page numbers are different for this. What I did was I cut and pasted from a website and put it all together. I could not find a complete document that was available to me, so I had to do some cutting and pasting. But on page 6, at the bottom in the last paragraph, the last sentence on the page, it says the United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. That sentence was added to the document and was passed without discussion, apparently, from what I have heard. It just kind of got stuck in there and stayed there. Through the years, every 4 years, the discipline is up for amendment. Almost everything except the Constitution can be amended by a single General Conference. And for the Constitution to be amended, then you have to propose the amendment, it has to be approved, and then it has to go out and be voted on by all the annual conferences in the world. But changes to wording anywhere outside of the Constitution of the United Methodist Church can be made by a single General Conference. That sentence in the social principles has been up for amendment every General Conference since 1972. Every 4 years, it's proposed that the wording of that either be changed or that the sentence itself be eliminated. And at every General Conference, the wording has been affirmed. It has been continued to be kept in the social principles. Now, remember what I said, that the social principles do not have the force of law. So it was not, nobody in the United Methodist Church had to believe or had to act, legally had to, act as though that were the policy of the United Methodist Church. People were free to affirm homosexual persons, homosexual relationships, if they chose to do so. There was no, at that time, there was no legal option for homosexual persons to be married to one another. That did not become state law in many states of the United States until the 2000s. I can't remember the exact year when the Supreme Court decision came down, but it's pretty recent. You're all aware that it's a pretty recent thing. That really ignited the arguments in the United Methodist Church, because it had been generally the understood policy, that it was something that had been affirmed over and over again at general conferences, that we didn't agree with homosexual action, but it was not something that we would take any action on as a church. Following the passing by a number of states, and then the affirmation by the Supreme Court that same-sex marriage, same-gender marriage would be a right throughout the United States. That ignited a drive to prevent or to enforce, if you will, that provision in the social principles by creating legislation in the behavior of pastors that prohibited pastors in the United Methodist Church from performing same-gender marriages. It also was put in that we will not ordain self-avowed practicing homosexual persons to the orders of deacon or elder, nor will we accept them as candidates for ministry or license them for local church ministry. Yes. Yes.
Which is a progressive congregation like we have here. We had a series in the adult classes on social principles.
Uh-huh.
That started out with a small group, and especially when we got to this part, we had people coming out of the woodwork with that series we had, which was very interesting and very popular, that issue on social principles.
Absolutely.
People didn't know about it.
A lot of people do not know that we even have a set of social principles, or that, or what is said in the social principles.
Matt, could you repeat that for those online? What John said?
John was saying that when they were in Florida, they did a course on the social principles and found that many people were unaware that there were the social principles or what was said in the social principles. I had the same experience in Greece as the 2016 General Conference approached. There was a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion in the public forum about what the position of the of the United Methodist Church would be. So I held a class on United Methodism 101, and it was a 6-week course, and it was much more involved than what we did. But people, when they read the social principles and read that part, that was the beginning of the movement in the Greece United Methodist Church, coming up from the lay people to be a reconciling United Methodist, or affiliating with the Reconciling Ministries Network, as this church has done. There was a similar movement in the Greece church, coming out of their outrage at this stuff is in the United Methodist discipline. Go ahead, Georgia. Is it the same policy? It still is the policy of the United Methodist Church, yes. That has remained unchanged. Again, every general conference, there is a proposal that language be changed or eliminated. And I have the what would have been proposed to the 2020 General Conference. And this is how the proposed legislation for 2020 would have read. We affirm human sexuality as a sacred gift and acknowledge that sexual intimacy contributes to fostering the emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being of individuals and to nurturing healthy sexual relationships that are grounded in love, care, and respect. Now that is language very similar to what is in the 2016. Human sexuality is a healthy and natural part of life that is expressed in wonderfully diverse ways from birth to death. It is shaped by a combination of nature and nurture, heredity and genetic factors on the one hand, and childhood development and environment on the other. We further honor the diversity of choices and vocations in relation to sexuality, such as celibacy, marriage, and singleness. We support the rights of all people to exercise personal consent in sexual relationships, to make decisions about their own bodies and be supported in those decisions, to receive comprehensive sexual education, to be free from sexual exploitation and violence, and to have access to adequate sexual health care. So they basically would have removed the prohibitive language from the proposed legislation. Now that document would be sent to a committee, a legislative committee, for recommendations for changes. Amendments would have no doubt have been made to that on the floor, and they would have been submitted for a vote. And we may have ended up with exactly the same wording that we currently have. What we now have, the social principles still say that that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. It also says that war is incompatible with Christian teaching. It's interesting that that has not been given the force of law in the United Methodist Church. But what happened, I believe it was 2012, it might have been the 2008, but recently the practice of among pastors of or among boards of ordained ministry of ordaining of approving people for ordination who were known to be homosexual, or the practice by pastors of performing marriages or allowing it to be done in the churches, was added to the list of chargeable offenses. There's in the back of the discipline, paragraph 2702, it's under the heading Chargeable Offenses and the Statute of Limitation. A bishop, clergy member of an annual conference, that would be me, I'm a member of the Upper New York Conference, a local pastor, clergy on honorable location or administrative location, diaconal minister, may be tried when charged, subject to the statute of limitations, with one or more of the following offenses: immorality, including, but not limited to, not being celibate in singleness or not faithful in a heterosexual marriage. B, practices declared by the United Methodist Church to be incompatible with Christian teachings, including, but not limited to, being a self-avowed practicing homosexual, or conducting ceremonies which celebrate homosexual unions, or performing same-sex wedding ceremonies. Then it goes on: crime, disobedience to the order and discipline, dissemination of doctrines contrary to the established doctrines of the United Methodist Church, various other chargeable offenses. But the performing of a homosexual marriage or allowing it to be done in a United Methodist Church, it has now become a chargeable offense. I could be brought up on charges. I could be stripped of my orders, my ordination, if I were to violate that particular provision. And there, in other sections, United Methodist churches are prohibited from allowing clergy of another denomination to come in and perform the wedding here in our building. Our relationship with the Reconciling Ministries Network, which recently was voted on, just prior to my being appointed as pastor here, that relationship announces to the world that we advocate for a change in that policy in the United Methodist Church. The Reconciling Ministries Network works toward there being no barriers to full participation of homosexual persons in churches, which means that, you know, if you are sitting there, a person sitting near you or next to you, and you want your child to be married in this church because it's been the church you were raised in and your family tradition, you were married here, your brothers and sisters were married here, et cetera, but the person sitting next to you does not have that right because that their child is a homosexual person. That, you know, it was seen as a justice issue, and also there are, some of our youth have come up. A number of people have come out of this church and have been ordained to the ministry in the Methodist Church or the United Methodist Church. Don Weaver being one of the people who was raised here. Peter LaValle came here in high school and came out of this church to ordination. There's a number of people. Greg Stierheim came out of this church and was ordained to the United Methodist ministry. We don't know who might otherwise have come out if they had not come out, so to speak. But persons who understood themselves to be homosexual were not allowed to be considered for ordination in the United Methodist Church, regardless of what their gifts for ministry might have been. So that's the question that has come before us. It has been has used up hours and hours and hours of committee time and floor time at general conferences. And finally, the various parties in the church, factions, if you will, have come to the table and decided that we are probably never going to come to full agreement on this. And it has become not just an issue of the politics or the internal workings of the United Methodist Church, but each side is accusing the other of not being serious about the Bible because we don't, because we're saying the Bible says this, and it's obvious to some people that the Bible doesn't say that or says the opposite. And it has gotten to be pretty mean. It has gotten to be very personal. Relationships among some of the clergy, as people who have been friends for years, barely speak to one another anymore. It's really difficult. And therefore, the various factions came together and worked out what is called a protocol. Let's see, what do they call it? Protocol for reconciliation and grace through separation and restructuring. Basically, we're going to agree to disagree and go our separate ways. The question is, who gets custody of the children? Who gets custody of? Do churches? First of all, who's going to leave? Who's going to be the United Methodist Church, and who's going to leave? Who gets to keep their buildings if they leave? Because it has been the case that if you left the United Methodist Church, if a local church left the United Methodist Church, they had to leave their building behind because the building is held in trust for it. Our building belongs to Kenmore United Methodist Church as long as Kenmore United Methodist Church exists. If we choose to no longer be Kenmore United Methodist Church and we want to become Kenmore Delaware Church, and drop the United Methodist affiliation, then the building no longer belongs to Kenmore United Methodist Church because Kenmore United Methodist Church ceases to exist. And the building then belongs to the United Methodist Church in the form of the annual conference. So when a United Methodist Church closes, its building belongs to the conference to do with as they choose. They can sell it back to the congregation. In years past, many times, if churches were leaving, a sort of under-the-table deal was done, so they would sell it back to the congregation for $1, and they would allow them to continue as Kenmore Community Church or Kenmore Delaware Church, whatever. But that doesn't have to happen. So if a church in the past has left the United Methodist Church, they left their building behind. Under this protocol, churches will be able to leave to affiliate with a different denomination and take their building with them.
And I point out the Episcopal Church went through the same situation. They're on Brighton Road with their church becoming a headquarters and the Anglicans moving to a temple.
Right. The Episcopal Church went through the same kind of split, and they had the same kind of provision in their deeds, what is called the trust clause, that the building is held in trust for the United Methodist Church. But part of the protocol for separation allows the creation of new Methodist denominations and the creation of a traditionalist new denomination, and the giving of some of the assets, some of the financial assets of the United Methodist Church to that new denomination. You know, we talk about who gets custody of the children. We have boards and agencies. We have the United Methodist Committee on Relief. We have the Board of Global Ministries. We have the United Methodist Women. We have, and each of these agencies owns property as well. The United Methodist Women, in particular, own lots of property, and some of it very, very expensive real estate. In Washington, D.C., right next to the Supreme Court building is the United Methodist Building, which is owned by the United Methodist Women. And there are a number of the Board of Church and Society has their headquarters there, directly across the street from the Capitol, directly across the street from the Supreme Court building. Pretty expensive real estate. Who gets custody of that child of the United Methodist Church? So there's all kinds of questions around separation that might do that. Only one denomination has been proposed that would be a separate Methodist denomination from the United Methodist Church would continue, but a traditionalist denomination has been proposed, has largely been organized. They have a leadership committee. They have a structure and what is essentially a United or a Methodist discipline that has already been drafted. They have people who will likely be elected as bishops and leaders of the church. There is one person from this general area who happens to be from our United Methodist annual conference, the Upper New York Annual Conference, who is one of 8 people on the leadership team, Reverend Steve Taylor, who is a pastor down in Panama, New York, down in Chautauqua County, who is on that leadership team. No other people from the Northeast are on the leadership, the proposed leadership team. And I put in your packets. It's a one-page. It's the last document that's in there. Some frequently asked questions about the Global Methodist Church, which would be a traditionalist, so-called traditionalist Methodist entity, and it's a church that uses very similar words to the United Methodist Church, committed to making disciples of Jesus Christ who worship passionately, love extravagantly, witness boldly. We believe the Global Methodist Church will be filled with warm-hearted, Jesus-loving, Holy Spirit-inspired people, grounded in Scripture and the life-giving confessions of the Christian faith as found in the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, which can be found at the back of your hymnals if you'd like to look at those at any time. Both the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed are in the back of the United Methodist hymnal, the red hymnal that's in the pews in front of you. Any questions at this point? I guess I've been... Okay. Well, that depends on where you are and who you're listening to. All true Bible-believing Christians in the United Methodist Church, according to the Global Methodist Church supporters, will be members of the Global Methodist Church. We don't know. In the southeastern jurisdiction, which would be the southeastern United States, a majority of churches, and let me back up, put it in reverse, beep, 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 beep. What will happen if the protocol passes? And one of the things that happens at General Conference is that every piece of legislation that is submitted is subject to amendment. So who knows what the protocol will look like at the end of General Conference. But if the protocol were to stay exactly as it is, then annual conferences would vote whether they would remain with the United Methodist Church or would join with the Global Methodist Church or another denomination. Any 100 local churches can create a new denomination under the protocol. So there may be several choices. But first of all, annual conferences would vote. So the Upper New York Conference would vote, are we going to remain the United Methodist Church, or are we going to affiliate with one of these new denominations? Then local churches will be given the option to vote whether they will go in the same direction that their annual conference is going, or do they want to go and affiliate with one of the other denominations. So if you have a choice between, let's just say there's only two choices, okay? There may be several other churches created. Upper New York will decide which way they're going to go. So let's say, just for discussion, the Upper New York Conference votes to remain with the United Methodist Church. Then the local churches, Kenmore United Methodist Church, Central Park United Methodist Church, Panama United Methodist Church, will vote whether they want to follow their annual conference or whether they want to affiliate with one of the new denominations. So Kenmore would put up for vote. We would discuss, it would be proposed, we would discuss, and then it would be put to a vote. Do we want to remain with the Upper New York Annual Conference, which would remain with the United Methodist Church? Or do we want to say, no, we're going to disaffiliate with the Upper New York Conference and we will go with the Global United Methodist Church or some other manifestation? There may be a hyper-progressive church that comes out, or an even more conservative and traditionalist Methodist church that comes out of this the potentially eventual split. I mean, potentially we could all stay together and continue as we've been, but it's not likely to happen. The wild card has been in recent years the annual conferences outside the United States, the so-called central conferences. They are generally growing, whereas the conferences, the number of churches in the United States is generally shrinking. Depends on the annual conference, but for the most part, we are shrinking in membership in the United States. And the annual conferences in other parts of the world are growing. So we don't know which direction they will go, but they tend to be more conservative theologically, but whether they will want to affiliate with another manifestation of Methodism or not, we don't know. It will be, the Global Methodist Church has some differences in structure from the United Methodist Church. Let's see. On the back, depending on how you're looking at it, I guess, the back page of this frequently asked questions: will local churches that join the Global Methodist Church own their property and assets, or hold them in trust for the general church? According to the Global Methodist Church's transitional Book of Doctrines and Discipline, local churches will own all their property and assets. Since it is widely assumed that the local churches and annual conference and central conferences that are strongly inclined to join the Global Methodist Church do not want to be part of a denomination with a quote-unquote trust clause, i.e. where local church property is held in trust for a general church, it is almost certain that the Global Methodist Church will never adopt a trust clause. Therefore, local churches in the Global Methodist Church will own all their property and assets in perpetuity. Another question is, will the Global Methodist Church have bishops? And if so, will they be bishops for life, as it is in the United Methodist Church? According to the Global Methodist Church's Transitional Book of Doctrines and Disciplines, paragraph 516.2, bishops will only serve for defined term limits. Once they serve their terms, they will either return to ministry in a local church or some area of service in the general church. It's widely assumed that delegates to the Global Methodist Church's convening general conference will endorse term limits for bishops. These are all questions that have come up through the history of what has become the United Methodist Church. Some of these were issues that divided the church back in the 1800s. The church that I just came out of, or that I had served for the last 10 years, was formed originally as a Methodist Protestant church, and the issue of bishops and whether women could be delegates to general conference, and the question of whether district superintendents would be appointed or elected, those were all questions that resulted in the formation of the Methodist Protestant Church back in the 1840s, or the 1820s. By the way, the Methodist Protestant Church did elect women to general conference. They did elect superintendents rather than appoint them. Their bishops were not bishops for life. There was in the Methodist Episcopal Church at the time, there was no lay representation at all at general conference or at annual conference. It was only the clergy that would meet. And the Methodist Protestants were in favor of lay representation. So those were all issues that eventually, they seemed like normal parts of the process, but they were controversial in their day and led to splits in the Methodist movement. Are there any questions so far? Have I lost you entirely? I mean, it gets sort of technical, but Don.
I think Matt has really explained, if you're confused, you aren't the only one.
Right.
Because everybody is confused. And personally, I felt it was important to elect delegates to the General Conference, and Barb was a lay member who would represent a broader outlook than what has been in the social principles. And then we have to wait and see. I mean, nobody knows. Nobody knows anything in terms of what direction it's going to go in. And that is a dilemma and is creating a lot of confusion in the whole church.
Yep.
I think you would agree.
I think that's,
It's hard to say what the direction will be. And when I talked with my grandson, Patrick, I told you, he's from Africa. And some of the countries in Africa, it's against the law to be homosexual.
right.
And you can be persecuted for being a homosexual. So for a delegate from that country to come to General Conference and vote differently puts them in jeopardy too. So it's a dilemma. It really is a dilemma.
Right.
And everybody is anxious. Because I have served in churches where I knew that the associate pastor was a homosexual, but that person could not say anything about it because if it became announced or he became open about it, he could be brought up on trial. So it's a real issue and a tough issue.
Sure.
And it stems from how you interpret the scripture. And everybody interprets scripture, even the ones that say they don't do.
Correct.
So that's a dilemma. And people are sincere on all sides.
Right.
That's part of the problem.
And as we are human beings, subject to human frailties, there are people seeking power on all sides as well, and personal influence or influence of their party. So it's both and. You know, there are people of good conscience on both sides, and there are people with agendas that serve their personal influence as well. On both sides, on all sides, whatever. Part of the what's anxiety producing is that this is not, all of this is on hold. All these things have been proposed, and the last time we got together to talk about them, it was open warfare on the floor of General Conference. That was 2019 at the special General Conference. And it was anticipated that there would be more warfare on the floor of 2020 conference. It may be that the protocol has been carefully enough crafted that it will pass without major changes or major argument. I don't know. It contains some provisions that allow a significant portion of the financial assets of the United Methodist Church to go to what will probably end up being the Global Methodist Church. a majority of the financial assets would be committed to a traditionalist denomination under the protocol. Depending on your point of view, you could view that as paying the folks off to quit arguing about it. I don't know whether that is fair or not. Well, nobody knows for sure how the churches in Africa and Asia are going to devote on it. Sometimes there are social concerns, as Don said. In some places, it's a death penalty offense to be a homosexual person, to practice homosexuality. That's a very small proportion, but it is, there are places where the United Methodist Church is an entity, and there are United Methodist churches and conferences, and it is illegal to be homosexual. Obviously, in those places, they will not have, they will not be ordaining homosexual persons, nor will they be doing same-gender marriages. There are provisions that there are other possible expressions that are outside the protocol that allow for the United Methodist Church to exist as a whole with differences geographically, differences in the discipline geographically, so that we could be one United Methodist Church, but there would be a discipline for the United States, and there would be a discipline for the Central Conferences of Africa, and there would be a discipline for the European churches, and for the churches in the Philippines and maybe other East Asian countries. That's another way of approaching it that may be proposed and that may be voted on. The protocol is something that was worked out, hammered out by representatives of all the major factions of the church. There will be some hyper-traditional and hyper-progressive factions that will oppose it, because it's kind of like the Congress and Senate of the United States. There are people in parties that will hold up legislation because because of one particular point. We've seen that happen in the Senate. There's some one line in a piece of legislation that they're not going to go for, and by golly, I'm just not going to support. I'm going to vote against the whole thing because this one provision is in there, and I will not bend, and therefore the whole thing falls apart. And some of that could happen in our church too. I hope that sometime soon, probably no later than 2024 anyway, General Conference will be held, that this will come to the floor, that there will be, as much as I would love to see the United Methodist Church stay together, I expect that there will be a split, if not more than one split. But if that's going to be the case, I'd like to see us get it done and allow us to get over to stop all the discussion, the wrangling, the fighting. So I encourage you to read the documents. It might, the frequently asked questions are going to probably answer your questions. You may have some others, but in both cases, the frequently asked questions on the protocol and on the Global Methodist Church, they are pretty good summaries, I think. I don't know that we need to have another session. We've set set aside an additional Sunday if we wanted to have another class on this. But I think I've run the course. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to talk to people about it. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody has all the answers unless they have the gift of prophecy, which I only have to. I will keep you up to date as things develop. Yes, and we'll try to. Eventually, if there's a point where we have to make decisions, I will, if I'm still here, will lead you through that. Who knows? The protocol will not take effect until we actually have a general conference, if it's approved. That is scheduled for September 2022. But the way things are, they may or may not meet. We can hope that the regularly scheduled general conference of 2024 would be probably the next. They wouldn't schedule yet another one in 2023, I don't think. It's a pretty expensive proposition to hold a general conference. After the protocol comes into effect, if it does, then there will be a period of voting, discussion and voting, and then there'll be a period of time before which it comes into effect. So I may well be retired before this happens. I don't know. Not knowing when it's going to happen, I can't tell you, but I will keep you as informed as I can. I would be glad to answer your questions that you have face to face. I won't pull any punches. I will let you know where I stand. I think you've probably figured out by now where I stand. But you don't have to agree with me. And I respect all different positions in terms of discussing things. I would be glad to talk to anybody from any point of view. So, thank you. Thank you all for coming and being part of things. Marty, here's your cleaning thing. You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no. Well, I can give you